My parents sat across from me at our kitchen table the summer before I started college and told me with completely straight faces that they simply didn't have the money to help with my tuition. "Times are tight right now, Angela," my mother said, reaching over to pat my hand the way you might comfort a child who'd just been told some small, manageable disappointment. I believed her completely. I had no reason not to. I took out student loans, worked 2 part-time jobs through all 4 years of school, skipped things other students took for granted, and never once, not for a single moment, questioned whether that story she told me was actually true. 11 years later, while helping my parents pack up boxes in their garage as they prepared to downsize their house for retirement, I found a folder of old bank records that made my stomach drop straight through the concrete floor I was kneeling on. The exact same year they told me money was simply too tight to help, they had paid my brother's college tuition in full, $80,000, in cash, spread across 4 separate deposits directly to his university. My name is Angela, and this is the story of the quiet lie I lived inside for over a decade without ever once suspecting it was one. I grew up in what most people, looking only from the outside, would have described as a perfectly ordinary, stable, middle-class household. My father worked steadily as an electrician for the same company for almost 30 years, the kind of dependable, unglamorous job that paid the bills consistently without ever making anyone rich. My mother managed the financial books for a small local accounting business part-time while running our household the rest of the time, handling grocery budgets and bill payments with the same careful precision she brought to her job. Money was never something we discussed openly at our dinner table, never argued about loudly the way some families do, but it was always present underneath nearly every decision, a quiet, persistent undertone of, "We need to be careful," that shaped far more of my childhood than I fully understood at the time. My older brother Marcus is 3 years older than me, and from a fairly young age I noticed, even if I couldn't articulate it clearly back then, a particular pattern in how our parents talked about each of us. Marcus was consistently described as the one with big potential, someone whose grades, even when they were genuinely just average, were celebrated and encouraged like meaningful achievements worth investing in. I was consistently described instead as the responsible one, a phrase that sounded complimentary on the surface but that I've come to understand, only much later, was actually doing a tremendous amount of quiet, invisible work underneath the surface of our family life. Being the responsible one meant, in practice, that I was the child who could be relied upon to need less, to ask for less, to simply manage whatever came my way without requiring anyone to step in and intervene on my behalf. This particular pattern showed up consistently, in small, easily overlooked ways, throughout almost my entire childhood and adolescence. When Marcus wanted new equipment for whatever hobby or interest he happened to be pursuing in a given year, whether it was sports gear, a new bicycle, or eventually a car for his 16th birthday, my parents generally found a way to make it happen, usually within a week or 2 of him asking. When I wanted to join a school club that required even a modest membership fee, something like $15 or $20 a year, I was gently encouraged, even at 11 or 12 years old, to see if I could find a way to cover it myself, perhaps through chores or saving up my small allowance. I babysat neighborhood children for years throughout middle school and high school to fund my own modest expenses. Clothes, school supplies, the occasional outing with friends, while Marcus's allowance simply increased steadily whenever he asked our parents for more, with very little pushback or discussion involved. By the time I was finishing high school, I had already, without fully realizing it, internalized the unspoken rule that I needed to be financially self-sufficient in ways my brother apparently never had to be. Still, when the topic of college tuition came up the summer before my freshman year, I assumed, reasonably I thought at the time, that my parents would help in whatever way they reasonably could, the way most parents try to for their children heading off to college. I remember that particular conversation at our kitchen table with a level of painful clarity that surprises me even now. All these years later, my father had come home from work, still wearing his work boots, sitting heavily in his usual chair at the head of the table, looking genuinely tired in a way that made the conversation feel even more believable. My mother had a calculator and a small notepad laid out in front of her, the kind of visual props someone arranges when they're preparing to deliver carefully considered financial news. "Angela, we need to talk honestly about tuition costs," she began, her voice gentle but firm. "Things have been tight financially this year. Your father's hours at work got cut back a bit. We're just genuinely not in a position right now to contribute much, if anything at all, toward your school expenses." I remember nodding along, genuinely understanding, genuinely not questioning a single word of what she was telling me. Why would I have questioned it? My parents had never lied to me about anything significant before, as far as I knew at the time, and there was no obvious reason for me to suspect otherwise now. I told them it was completely fine, that I would figure out loans and scholarship applications on my own, that I genuinely didn't want them stressing themselves out over my education when there were clearly other financial pressures at play. My mother actually became a little emotional during that conversation, telling me how proud she was of how mature and understanding I was being about the entire situation. I left that conversation that evening feeling, strangely, like the responsible adult in the room, even though I was only 17 years old at the time, barely old enough to even sign my own loan paperwork without parental involvement. What followed over the next 4 years was a sustained period that, while not miserable in any dramatic sense, required a constant, low-level financial stress that quietly shaped almost every major decision I made during that critical stretch of my early adult life. I worked nearly 20 hours a week at a small campus coffee shop throughout the academic year, carefully scheduling my class load around my available shifts. And I worked full-time, often picking up overtime hours, at a retail job every single summer break. I took out federal student loans to cover whatever portion my limited scholarships and modest part-time income simply couldn't reach. I chose elective courses partly based on which time slots wouldn't conflict with my work schedule, rather than purely based on academic interest. I quietly skipped study abroad opportunities that other students around me mentioned casually, almost carelessly, because I genuinely couldn't justify the additional expense, even though some part of me deeply wanted that experience. Throughout all of this, my parents would occasionally mention, almost as a form of gentle encouragement during phone calls or holiday visits, how genuinely impressed they were that I was handling everything so independently at college. I took real, genuine pride in hearing that description at the time, internalizing it as a meaningful compliment about my character, rather than recognizing it, as I eventually would much later, as a quiet justification for a financial decision that had already been made without my full knowledge. I graduated with just under $35,000 in student loan debt, a figure I spent the better part of the following decade slowly, steadily paying down, often having to sacrifice other important financial goals along the way, like saving meaningfully toward a future home, simply to keep up consistently with those monthly loan payments. Marcus, during those same exact 4 years, attended a private university located roughly 2 hours away from our hometown. I genuinely never thought much at the time about how he was managing to pay for an education at a private institution, which everyone generally understood to be considerably more expensive than the public university I'd chosen partly for cost reasons. I simply assumed, the way you sometimes assume things about siblings without ever actually gathering direct evidence either way, that he'd worked out some reasonable combination of loans, scholarships, and modest family help, similar in spirit to my own situation. We never once discussed the specific financial details directly with each other during those years, not a single time, despite being siblings who otherwise got along reasonably well. 11 years after my own graduation, my parents finally decided it was time to downsize from the house I'd grown up in, into a smaller, more manageable place better suited to their retirement years. I volunteered, without much hesitation, to help them sort through literal decades of accumulated paperwork stored in their garage, mostly old tax documents, expired warranties, and several filing cabinets that, as far as I could tell, nobody had properly organized or gone through in many, many years, deep inside one particular drawer, tucked beneath folders simply labeled with mundane household categories like appliance manuals and old insurance policies. I came across a thick manila folder labeled, in my mother's familiar handwriting, simply Marcus University. Out of nothing more than ordinary curiosity, the kind you naturally feel while sorting through old family paperwork, I opened it, half expecting to find nothing more interesting than old report cards or a framed acceptance letter from years earlier. What I found instead were detailed bank statements and deposit records spanning precisely the same 4-year period during which I had been working 2 separate jobs and steadily taking out loans to fund my own education. The records clearly showed 4 separate, substantial cash deposits made directly into Marcus's university student account, each one timed carefully at the very start of a new academic year, totaling exactly $80,000 across the full 4 years of his schooling. I sat down slowly on the cold concrete floor of that garage, the open folder resting across my lap, and I stayed there for what genuinely felt like a very long time, quietly doing math in my head that I desperately did not want to be doing. Over the following several days, unable to simply set this discovery aside and move on with my life as if I'd never seen it. I quietly continued digging through the remaining boxes in that garage, specifically searching now for anything related to that same critical time period in my own academic history. I found my own old loan paperwork relatively easily, filed away separately in its own box, almost as though it belonged to an entirely different, unrelated category of family history altogether. I carefully cross-referenced every date I could find. The exact same summer my parents had sat me down at that kitchen table and told me, gently but firmly, that money was simply too tight to help with my tuition, was the very same summer that the very first $80,000 payment toward Marcus's private university education had already cleared their joint bank account, weeks before that conversation with me even took place. This wasn't some innocent misunderstanding about timing, nor was it some kind of accounting confusion I could reasonably rationalize away with a more generous interpretation. The numbers were specific, clearly dated, and simply impossible to misread or misinterpret in any meaningful way. My parents had, in that very same conversation where they told me they had genuinely nothing left to offer, already spent a substantial sum of money on my brother's private education that exact year, and would go on to continue doing so for 3 additional years after that. All while I worked double shifts throughout college and accumulated loan debt I would still be carefully paying off well into my early 30s. I didn't confront either of my parents. Immediately after this discovery, I needed real time to simply sit with what I'd found, to slowly separate the practical, financial reality of the situation from the much heavier, more complicated emotional weight sitting underneath it. The simple, deeply painful question of why this particular lie had ever felt necessary to tell a 17-year-old version of me in the first place. About 2 weeks later, I brought that same folder along with me to a planned family dinner with my parents, deliberately choosing a quiet, calm moment after the meal had finished, rather than starting the evening with any kind of immediate confrontation. I placed the folder gently on the table between us and said, simply without much preamble, "I found this while helping you pack up. The garage last week." I watched my mother's expression shift almost instantly the moment she recognized the familiar handwriting on the folder's label. My father was the first one to actually speak, his tone immediately somewhat defensive. "Angela, that was a long time ago now. Things were complicated back then. You have to understand," I told him, calmly and deliberately, that I genuinely wasn't there that evening to relitigate decisions that had already been made over a decade earlier in the past. "I just want to honestly understand," I said, "why I was specifically told there wasn't any money available. The exact same year there clearly, demonstrably was, just apparently not for me." My mother, to her credit, didn't attempt to deny the clearly documented facts now sitting directly in front of her on the table. She admitted, somewhat haltingly, choosing her words carefully, that they had genuinely believed, at the time, that Marcus needed more support to actually succeed, given some of his earlier academic struggles in high school, while they had always quietly viewed me as someone who would find a way regardless of the circumstances. She said it hadn't been intended as a deliberate lie exactly, more as a private decision they had made together, and simply never properly explained to me, assuming, I think, that I would either never find out the truth, or perhaps never even think to question it directly if I somehow did. I didn't raise my voice during that entire conversation, and I didn't demand any kind of immediate financial repayment or formal compensation on the spot, though I won't pretend that particular thought never crossed my mind at all in the difficult days that followed our conversation. What I genuinely wanted, more than anything purely financial, was simply for the full truth of the situation to be openly acknowledged, clearly and honestly, without convenient excuses dressed up to sound like reasonable explanations after the fact. I told my parents, as honestly as I could manage, that the money itself, while certainly significant in practical terms, wasn't actually the most painful part of what I had discovered in that garage. The genuinely harder part was slowly realizing that an entire narrative I had quietly carried about myself for well over a decade, the comforting story of naturally being more responsible, more inherently capable of independently handling hardship than my brother, had actually been carefully built, without my knowledge, on a foundation they had quietly constructed themselves, simply by deciding privately, without ever telling me, that I needed considerably less support than my brother did. My father eventually said something that, while certainly not a complete or perfect apology, at least felt genuinely honest in that moment. "We thought, at the time, that we were being fair, by giving each of you what we believed you individually needed most. I can see now, looking back, that wasn't actually fair to you at all. It wasn't everything I might have wanted or hoped to hear from him in that moment. But it was, at the very least, true. I didn't formally ask my parents to repay my old student loans, though they did, entirely on their own initiative, eventually offered to contribute meaningfully toward whatever balance still remained, once everything had been openly and honestly discussed between us. I accepted a portion of that offer, mostly because refusing it entirely outright felt, to me, more like making a symbolic point than actually addressing the genuine financial imbalance that had quietly existed between us for so many years. My relationship with Marcus, once he eventually learned the full specific details of the situation, became noticeably more complicated for a while afterward. He genuinely hadn't known the precise specifics of how his own private education had actually been funded either, having simply assumed, much like I once had myself, that our parents had handled financial matters fairly and equally across both of us. We've talked through the entire situation honestly together since then, multiple times. And while our relationship is certainly different now than it was before, it hasn't been permanently damaged in any lasting way. I think often, even now, about that 17-year-old version of myself sitting quietly at our kitchen table, nodding along understandingly, feeling a genuine sense of pride in her own apparent maturity, while being told something that simply, factually was not true. I don't believe my parents ever set out at the time with any deliberate intention to hurt me. I think they made a decision rooted in old, comfortable, long-standing assumptions about which of their two children genuinely needed protecting, and which one could presumably handle things entirely on her own. And then they simply never circled back, not once in over a decade, to honestly examine whether that original assumption had actually been fair to me all along. What I've ultimately learned through this entire experience is that the stories we're told about ourselves while growing up, labels like responsible or independent, aren't always the genuine compliments they're often dressed up to sound like. Sometimes instead, they're simply convenient explanations offered for decisions that were never really about us as individuals at all. I spent well over a decade genuinely believing I had built my own personal resilience entirely through my own individual effort and character. What I actually discovered, 11 years later, sitting on a cold garage floor, was that I had built a significant portion of my early adult life shaped quietly, invisibly, around a choice that had been made for me long before I was even old enough to properly question it.